Mr. State Secretary, dear Anna and Erika, panelists, dear friends, it's a great pleasure for me to warmly welcome you to this, the second ever presentation of a business climate survey in Germany for Swedish companies. And as you know, we conducted the first survey last year under the very dire circumstances that a global pandemic brings with it. And at the presentation, we could also note there was a lot of anxiety and pessimism among the companies when it comes to investments and recruitment plans and so on. But luckily this year, while we're still in the same pandemic, thanks to the vaccines, we now see a lot more optimism and we see the light at the end of the tunnel. Companies are now again planning investments, planning recruitment, and pose a quite positive picture of the future. And the same, of course, goes for the GDPs of our both countries. Germany remains Sweden's strongest trading partner. If we look back at the developments last year, sure, there was a decrease in the volume of trade between our countries, but it was a lot less than the European average, which I see as a good sign that we have a strong foundation in our economic and trade relations. And looking into the future might be difficult since we're still in the pandemic, but I see great potential for even much more. To illustrate what I mean, let's just mention a few things. We have the innovation partnership since 2 years. All sectors are growing, getting more and more concrete. We have the digital and sustainable recovery plans of all EU member states, $750 billion that are to be invested in green technology and in digitization. We have investments in artificial intelligence. We have productions of sustainable batteries and green hydrogen. So the future is, I think, quite good, looks quite good. And I believe that we have a huge potential to work even closer together. But I'm now quite eager to get into the substance, and I would have handed over to State Secretary Krister Nilsson, but he's stuck in traffic in Stockholm. So instead, it's my pleasure to introduce Anna and Erika to present the results of the study. And after that, State Secretary Krister Nilsson will then address us. I wish you all a very joyful and fruitful afternoon here with us. Anna, please.
Thank you very much, Per. So I'm very glad to be here today, to be part of the team presenting the Business Climate Survey, representing Business Sweden as Country Manager and Trade Commissioner. And you will later also meet my colleague, Erika Jaeckel. But the Business Climate Survey is really a teamwork. So it's done in what we call Team Sweden setup, in joint collaboration with the Swedish Embassy in Germany, as well as the Chamber of Commerce in Germany, and of course, with the very important input of the German-Swedish business community. But it's not only us in Germany that are conducting this survey. We are actually doing this in 22 markets across the globe. So this is very interesting data to see, especially in this time, how Swedish global business is developing. And Business Climate Survey, in a way, it's self-explaining what it is all about. But we see it as a very important tool to take the temperature of the business climate and to learn from that and to get inspired to grow global business even further. So now over to the highlight of today, the actual result of the Business Climate Survey. Please, Erika, you have some very promising new things to share with us today.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Anna. It's been very interesting to gather these results over the last few months, and I'm excited to share them with you now. The outlook has clearly changed compared to last year, as was already mentioned. as Swedish companies are so much more positive now. So with that said, let's get to it and see the presentation. I'll start off by explaining or presenting the sample to you of the survey, moving on to the economic outlook, how it's perceived, and then to the market, the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic, and lastly, how our sample views sustainability. But starting off with the sample then. Just as last year, the survey was conducted this spring and the results were gathered from the end of March until mid-April. Our sample that consists of 87 different companies are of different sizes. And in terms of global employees, they are 38% of them are large and equally many are viewed as small companies. The remaining part, 20%, have 250 to 1,000 employees. However, the majority of the companies have less local employees. So the numbers that we are seeing right now, I think we're having some technical issues. Thank you, are for the global employees. They are active across a wide range of industries, such as industrial equipment, consumer goods, construction, and retail, to mention a few bigger ones. On an aggregated level, 39% are in the industrial section and 24% are in professional services. 22% are in consumer goods. Lastly, while many players have been active on the German market since the last century, in recent years, we've seen an inflow of Swedish companies expanding to Germany. And in fact, 14% of our sample have established their operations in Germany in the past 5 years. So all in all, we have a good mix of companies. However, the industrial segment is a bit overrepresented. But now that you're familiar with the sample, we can move on to the actual results of the survey, starting off with the economic outlook. So despite the slowing growth of the German economy in recent years, and especially the still ongoing pandemic, the vast majority of our sample report a profitable financial performance in 2020. It's clear that the industrial companies have suffered the least. They make up the majority of companies with a profitable financial performance, and only 15% of them have experienced a loss in the past year. And this really speaks to how strong the industrial sector is in Germany. When asking about this in follow-up interviews, which we also conducted, companies claim that the generous German support schemes have played a very important role and saved many companies from suffering a loss this past year. So to sum up, for many companies, things simply did not turn out as bad as they expected. And holding on to those expectations, we did ask about expectations both this year and last year. We asked how companies expected their industry's turnover to develop in the coming year. You see last year's answers in blue and this year's answers in yellow. In 2020, it's evident that the outlook was very pessimistic, and a lot of us can probably relate to having that mindset in March 2020. Then over 60% expected their industry turnover to decrease significantly or slightly. So last year, the consumer demand dropped, which simply caused this outlook to be so pessimistic. However, when we asked this question now, answers were very different. Now, over 70% expect a slight or significant increase in industry turnover. The consumer demand is back, but most importantly, the uncertainty is no longer as strong. So although life is not back to normal, there is a certain confidence in the market again. And this is very positive since the trade was stagnating in 2020, but now it seems to be turning, which is also in line with the more positive GDP forecast for Germany. According to our respondents and in follow-up interviews, this is, again, thanks to the German support schemes that truly have supported businesses in the past year. We will get back to the effects of the pandemic and how it was handled by the German government later in this presentation. As a last part of the economic outlook, we're going to look at the investment plans of Swedish companies. Given this year's much more positive outlook, it's no surprise that the investment appetite among Swedish companies is back. Again, you see last year's answers in blue and this year's answers in yellow. Last year, only 24% planned to increase their investment. And this year, the same number is 44%. This means that in only 1 year, this number has nearly doubled. And the optimism is clearly also mirrored in terms of investment. The investment appetite is the strongest amongst newcomers. 75% of newcomers plan to slightly or significantly increase their investments. As seen previously, a substantial commitment is required when entering the German market, and newcomers seem to be aware of this, which we find very positive. So all in all, the economic outlook is positive. Swedish companies believe in an increase in their industry's turnover, and 44% plan to increase investment. This truly shows the belief in the German markets. And now we can move on to the markets in the agenda. And as the name of the business climate survey gives away, we ask Swedish companies how they perceive the business climates in Germany. Again, last year's answers are shown in blue, and this year's answers are shown in yellow. Last year, the feelings towards this question were pretty mixed. An equal number of respondents perceived the German business climate as positive, as the share that perceived it as negative. These answers were gathered in late March and April last year, and as we all know, the situation was pretty different back then. This year, the share of companies finding the business climate poor or very poor has decreased from 34% to only 14%. Accordingly, the share of companies perceiving it as neutral and as very good or good has also increased. 44% of our sample perceive the business climate as good or very good now. The German IFO Institute, the Institute for Economic Research, famously conducts a monthly business climate index. In the May edition, which was only published 2 weeks ago, they write that the sentiment among German managers has improved considerably. And they state that the business climate index rose to 99.2 points in May, which is the highest value in 2 years. They also state that the German economy is picking up on speed. This shows that the positive perception of the German business climate is not only something that Swedish companies feel, but a trend felt across the entire German market. We also asked Swedish companies about the market conditions and how well these meet the needs of the companies. In general, Swedish companies are happy with the market conditions, but the level of digitalization stands out negatively, which you can see at the bottom here in the slide. Last year, the level of digitalization also stood out negatively, and this is clearly something that Swedish companies are not content with on the German market. However, one should keep in mind that Swedish companies are famous for their digital prowess and clearly have both high standards and high expectations of this, which might explain the contentness with the level of the digital landscape. But as pointed out by one of our interviewees, the digital affinity of Swedes and Swedish companies was a great advantage when entering a pandemic, when companies were so reliant on the digital infrastructure. Swedish companies were more prepared for this, which potentially served as a real advantage. For the first time this year, we also asked Swedish companies what they perceive as obstacles on the German market. The low level of digitalization also permeated the answers to this question. One of the reasons for the low level of digitalization, according to our sample, is the high data protection standards in Germany. This actually hinders both companies and authorities from digitalizing processes, because they're so restrictive on what data actually can be stored digitally, which leads to more time-consuming and complex paperwork. The low level of digitalization is also a big part of the high degree of bureaucracy, which causes administrative issues. For instance, the contact to authorities, which is very complex. An example of this is in the past year when a lot of companies in Germany needed to reach out to German authorities. But there was no standard processes for this to be digital, which caused it to be very time-consuming, according to our interviewees. Lastly, the labor legislation in Germany is perceived as burdening, since the employment protection in Germany is very high. This causes companies to be very restrictive when thinking about hiring new employees. So all in all, the market conditions are good and the business climate has improved substantially over the last year. but there is always room for improvement, and we see this especially in the digital area. Moving on to the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic. When asking our sample what measures they took as a response to the COVID pandemic, we got mixed answers. Almost equally many who had to lay off employees could also hire new ones. A lot of companies also paused their planned investments, and over 40% enjoyed benefits such as the employment subsidies, short-time work or Kurzarbeit. The most chosen measure taken by Swedish companies was an increase in digitalization efforts. Almost 50% chose this answer. We believe that this is interesting since the general level of digitalization is still perceived as low, but we can now see that real efforts have been made throughout the last year. This is also confirmed in a report released this March by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. The report states that the corona crisis led to a considerably yet unplanned surge in digitalization. The home office, for instance, is described as an area where Germany managed to adapt from the physical environment to the digital relatively quickly, although Germany is behind many other OECD countries in terms of digital infrastructure and the usage thereof. We also asked a more specific question on how Swedish companies benefited from the German support schemes. The answer showed that employment subsidies were the most frequent in our sample, as already mentioned, over 40% received this, and about 15% benefited from some kind of tax relief, such as a lowered VAT. The main key takeaway here is that the support schemes played a very important role when in stabilizing the German market and the economy in general. As stated in follow-up interviews, the governmental support simply provided the security and the faith that a lot of companies needed. Moving on to the last thing here in the presentation of the business climate survey, sustainability. We asked Swedish companies to what extent they believe that customers in their industry consider environmental aspects of a product or service in the purchasing process. Over 80% claim that this is considered to some extent, and 42% claim that it's considered much or very much. The segment that seems to care the most about this is the consumer product segment. Here, 89% think that the customers consider it to some extent, and 56% think it's considered much or very much. Sustainability was also a big part of both German and EU support schemes, and going green is seen as an important part in making Germany fit for the future. So we believe that this is an area to keep an eye on that will gain importance over time. Just as a last stop here, I would like to shortly summarize the results of the survey. There are about 1,500 Swedish companies active in Germany. Looking back, 59% of our sample enjoyed a profitable 2020. They perceive the business climate as neutral to good, which is an improvement from last year. And looking forward, 71% of our sample think that there will be an increase in their industry's turnover, and 44% of respondents plan to increase their investments. There are also several advantages of the German market, such as the size, the GDP, the location in the middle of Europe, and the diversity of the market. There are also some areas of improvement that are disadvantages at the moment, like the bureaucracy, the low degree of digitalization, high data protection standards, and the burdening labor law. And by that, I would like to hand over to Staatssekretär Krister Nilsson in Stockholm. Welcome to a digital Berlin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much from a rainy Stockholm.
Okay, the sun might be shining here, but let's not talk about that.
Yeah, no, I thank you for having me, and thank you so much for having the opportunity to take part in this very important event, this webinar. I think it's so important that we, due to our partnership in general, between Sweden and Germany. We see Germany as a key partner. It's of course also important to see what is the business climate like, and how can we improve in the strong relationship we already have bilaterally. I think it's the great partnership is partly because of we sharing many of the values and the interests, not least in the context of trade, of course. So both bilaterally and within the EU, there is a strong relationship, and in that perspective, this report is of course in great interest on a political level as well for those discussions. And of course, Germany is one of the most important export markets as well. But also, I think we should not underestimate the partnership between industries and business sectors, but also the partnership between sectors and companies. So there is, of course, also the fact that we, as you just mentioned, we have 1,500 companies, Swedish enterprises in Germany, and that is, of course, also a very strong platform for this relationship and the partnership, and to grow that. So with this background, it's very important to listen, as I said, to the insight that you just presented, because we want to see both identifying the challenges, and you mentioned the digitalization and as one of them, but also seeing the possibilities of increasing the business relation between Sweden and Germany. Our political dialogue is frequent, and just recently the Minister of Trade, Anna Hallberg, and her German colleague, Peter Altmaier, talked about how to strengthen our relationship even further. And one of the strong platforms we have for the bilateral discussions and developing our interest relating to the business sector and industry is, of course, the innovation partnership that was established by Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Löfven in 2017. It's a great platform for cooperation, bringing together governments, institutions, authorities in particularly strategic areas. And of course, that together with this business climate survey shows and reflects the ambitions of developing even further. The areas of cooperation in that platform is as identified: electrification, batteries, artificial intelligence, innovations in small and medium-sized enterprises, and e-health. And of course, the cooperation is broader, but I think it's important to mention this as the strategic areas. And of course, this reflects also then the cooperation that is strong between Swedish and German industry. There has been lots of successful mergers, cross-wise investments in strategic areas, such as the battery and automotive sector, and many other partnerships. So I think it's important to see the possibilities that we have when we have the political platform and the dialogue bilaterally, but we also have the strong cooperation and partnership on the business side. And of course, when we overlap and strengthen each other, that gives us more opportunities moving forward. Foreign trade is so important for us, so of course we are very happy to, on the political side, also have the cooperation in what is now to become called the Stockholm 8, an initiative with like-minded, where also Germany is playing a crucial role, and therefore we also share the perspective of the export possibilities, the open trade, the ability for the partnerships that we discuss here today, and the business development to also have the trade perspective, and including that in the possibilities that we should explore. And I think, as mentioned, we have a turbulent year behind us, and not least in the trade perspective. There are challenges to overcome and recover from. But the climate survey report, I think, also shows that there is a reason for optimism. As mentioned, many of the companies shows that there have been a strong year behind. There is a strong belief in development. You, as companies that are represented in this webinar, are well prepared. You talked about the digitalization, but we also have the sustainability that was mentioned, the amount of innovation spirit that is included in the partnership and our companies is, of course, something that makes us able to adapt. And if we have that possibility with discussion politically and the business sector, I think we will manage quite well. And the strategic areas that I mentioned before is areas where we see now post-pandemic period that when we are rebuilding infrastructure, when we are rebuilding economies, that is very much the areas that are demanded for and technologies that are demanded for. So in that regard, there is a reason to being optimistic. So according to the survey, many of the companies, as I said, look back on a profitable year and also are expecting a turnover to increase in the coming years, and that is, of course, very good news. But also, as you mentioned, the acknowledgement, according to the survey, that 74% of the Swedish companies in Germany think that sustainability is taken into account in the customer purchasing decision. I think that is a very positive information and news, and showing that as I said, the strategic partnerships and what we are looking forward to is also a market demand, not least in the consumer areas. So there are many good things to build on and to develop when we look back on a difficult year, but also identifying the possibility forward. So I would just finalize by saying thank you so much to the team Sweden in Germany for an excellent report. Definitely, I think it's something that we can reflect and bring into the bilateral discussions on a political level. And I'm so happy to see that they are mirroring the political agenda we have and the bilateral discussions, also with what is now the strong ways forward for the business sector, and that we have the mutual interest in developing the Swedish-German cooperation even further. So thank you so much for having me and just being able to make some comments on the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krister. And I hope we are back in Berlin. So wonderful listening to our State Secretary Krister Nilsson, so in depth on the German-Sweden relationship, and very inspiring also to hear our political leadership taking such an interest in our study and looking at the positive outlook. So now let's turn to some voices from the actual business community, Swedish business community here in Germany. And I'm very glad to have with me on the panel today Thomas Ryberg, chairman of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce in Germany, as well as Marie-Sophie von Bibra, country manager Germany for Readly, a Swedish digital newspaper and magazine subscription service. And if you are representing overall the voice of the Swedish business in Germany, Marie-Sophie, you are of course a strong representative for consumer business as well as service business, which we see is a growing segment in Germany from Sweden's side. And finally, Mr. Josef Hinterberger, President Getinge DACH. Getinge, of course, famous Swedish medtech company with a very global set of. And Josef, you are in a way with us today representing this industrial side of Swedish business. of course, as the med tech and healthcare industry, which of course had you had very interesting 18 months behind you and maybe in front of you as well. We have roughly 25 minutes ahead of us here for discussions, and we like to make this as interactive as possible. So there is also a possibility to share questions or comments to the panel here, or maybe to something the earlier presenters have mentioned today. So please do that, and I hope that I will be able to catch it up here on my iPad and bring that into the panel. So please, again, audience, send in your questions on the chat. But then to open up the panel, I would like to turn to you, Thomas. We are doing the business climate once per year, but you are in constant dialogue with the Swedish business in Germany, the members of the Swedish chamber here. When you listen to the results of the survey, of course, with a positive outlook, is that also what you hear straight from your member companies?
Yes, of course. It's a very positive climate from the Swedish companies in Germany at the moment. Not just from the Swedish companies, actually, the whole society in Germany are quite positive, also other companies. But I think what's new for newcomers on the German market, I think it's basically Swedes are more positive, I think, and used to get different challenges and take care of them. And the German companies, they like to find and analyze and find problems and talk a lot about problems. And 1 year ago, it was actually impossible to talk about anything else than problems. And of course, if we always talk about problems, we find problems, and then we have problems. And it changed after the summer, actually. It changed, and not that fast as in Sweden. We are changing very fast in Sweden, as you know. But now it's the big German economy is running in the right way, and it's very, very positive also for big Swedish companies, also for small Swedish companies in Germany, and the attitude and it's very, very positive at the moment for the German market.
That is good news as well. Marie-Sophie and Josef, would you like to comment on that as well? What Thomas mentioned here, and Erika brought it up, for example, that the leading think tank, the IFO Institute, is saying that we are moving from a recovery phase to a boom phase. How is that for your businesses?
Yeah, I can mirror that, and it's exactly what I see as well. And what I think is very interesting, because there is definitely a lot of truth to what Thomas said also about the German mentality being faced with this situation, that I think what I see in the environment we work with right now is that there's two sides. One is kind of advocating to just go back to how it was before and as fast as possible, whereas the other side is really taking the time to look at what has been learned in this time and what can we now implement. And I think I'm right now moving in these two categories, which is sometimes very difficult, because I'm a very strong advocate for how I want us to really almost take advantage of the situation, take this accelerated pace for change and look at the improvements and the learnings we've made. But sometimes, especially in a German environment, that isn't necessarily easy. So I'm very curious also to see how we can now act on these changes. And I really hope that that trend towards improvements can be kept. I think for our industry, we've seen that a lot of the mentality has been accelerated. So we're now talking about projects that a year ago would never have been possible, but also 2 years ago wouldn't have been possible because the mentality wasn't there yet. So I take a lot of encouragement and drive out of that, and I hope that we can use that on all fronts.
Interesting, and of course also Marie-Sophie, with the digital reading and subscription service, you are also representing a part of the business community that had a strong push and really were part of the leapfrog of changed behaviors that we've seen during the pandemic. Josef, how is business climate when you're president of Getinge Dach?
Yeah, I mean, there was, on the negative side of a pandemic for Getinge, there was a positive impact. I mean, you know that we are the biggest ventilator producer in the world, and our colleagues here in Stockholm, Sweden, and a big applause to them what they achieved and did during the pandemic. I mean, you probably heard that on the news in Sweden already, but they were able to increase production output. And this is to echo on Thomas that the Swedish are changing fast and quickly 3 times. So we were really ramping up production like no tomorrow. So, and this is due to the enthusiasm, the passion of the people we have in Sweden, and the changeability of the structure. So, but to your question about the climate in Germany, after the first scary month where everybody was sitting and waiting what will happen, we got some good feeling about what does it mean to be in a pandemic and to manage it. And we all, industry as such, had struggled to get the supply chain again up to speed, very important factors. But I think there was also good support from the German government. And I can really speak for our company that we got personal support from the government to support our supply chains, which is, of course, for a producer and an industrial producer, it's very important. And outlook is still positive, and we see a good trend to get back with production sites and sub-vendors back to the European market, less import from Asia and other markets. So in general, a very good environment, I would say, for growth, and not only for our medtech part, but I would say in general for the industrial part.
Mm-hmm. Josef, what you mentioned there about your supply chains, and of course, if we all think back a year, that was on all the big news, which countries that were stopping which containers containing different kind of medical safety equipment. And this is, of course, a huge trend that everybody's talking about, moving. We've been having a very strong globalization trend in past 10, 20 years. And now we see that there is a bit of a backlash looking at more as regionalization. How do you see that Getinge is how are you taking that into account, globalization versus regionalization?
So we very strongly, but this was already done before the pandemic. Getinge was trying to diversify the factories, the supply chains. So we were not putting everything in one basket and produce where it's the cheapest. For us, it was important to keep up supply security. I mean, this is probably by nature of our business. Specifically for Germany, we can say we continue to invest in local production, local R&D, and with a very strong European footprint. I mean, also in Sweden, there's a lot of investment this year and the coming years, but also in Germany. Just to give you a rough number, 200 million SEK will be invested this year in German factories. And I think this is also mirroring the general trend. We have a geographical footprint everywhere, not only everything in one geographical region or even basket with small global footprint. So supply chain gets more important, and the value of local production is increasing. So also for the mid-segment companies, it's a good headwind, not a headwind, so backwind, so that they get support from that and can be as good sub-vendors.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Also interesting to hear about your further investment plans. That's of course also something that we saw overall in the surveys, that a large part of the Swedish companies are now turning into investments again. I would now like to dwell on kind of two of the key areas of Swedish trade strength. One is digitalization and one is sustainability. And Marie-Sophie, I think you were already a bit, let's say, aiming at the trend of digitalization. I would even see it in some areas saying that Germany has made a kind of a leapfrog, or at least a smaller leapfrog during the pandemic. Both how business is done, but also in the say behavior of us as consumers. And of course, Marie-Sophie, you are really in the middle of that, and at the same time you are representing a business segment where Sweden is very much in the forefront. You have several good Swedish colleagues also in the area of digital media and digital reading, and at the same time, there are some very strong German actors as well in the same landscape. So how important for Readly was the whole digitalization leapfrog during the pandemic?
I mean, it was a huge and also in some way almost needed acceleration that we've been kind of waiting for. We wouldn't have wanted it under these circumstances, but for us, the numbers actually skyrocketed overnight, which isn't something we were prepared for. And we also didn't foresee it as the pandemic started and as we all went into lockdown. We didn't foresee that the behavior of people would actually change overnight, but that's what happened. And it was last year, April, when suddenly the numbers went up like that because people were at home and the behavior changed from one day to the next. You turn to reading and to other digital services. And I think it caught us off guard in a way. We then managed to really make the most out of it for the rest of the year. We increased our investments from the very beginning of the year and haven't stopped since. And we also saw that that was a change that from a consumer perspective was something that isn't changing now. It's something that consumers have almost been asking for and saying, we want digital solutions that fit our changing lifestyle. And in our industry, when we talk about media and publishing and newspapers and magazines, there was a certain resistance, I would say, almost from the traditional players, which now, given the current climate, we see our task also in balancing that out, because we work very closely with our publishing partners. We know that the last year for them was very difficult. So our responsibility now is to try to create that balance and to make it possible to see the potential and to really make it about the customer and about kind of how can we create platforms and solutions that now really become future-proof, which wasn't as necessary yet 2 years ago. So it's been a year of many conversations on all levels and kind of looking at what do the solutions look like and how can we accelerate the pace, but really take everyone on that journey so that no one gets left behind. Some of those conversations are easier than others, as you can imagine, because it really depends on the state of mind. And it depends on whether you accept also what happened or whether you're still fighting it. And I think that's what I see for also digitalization in general for Germany. Also in regards to home office, we as a Swedish company were set up for home office perfectly from the beginning. So we close our office, we send people home, but it wasn't a difficult shift as such. But I know from the environment that I see that also a lot of companies are now just going back straight away into the very traditional way of office working, to the very big resistance of employees. So of course, this is different for every business sector, but in this growing industry that I'm in, I think it really requires companies to also look at these changes that happened last year and to not make mistakes of just jumping back, but to really try and see it as an opportunity to now change things going forward.
Interesting. I really love what you say there, but also from a kind of a business community perspective, you are thinking the way of that no one should be left behind in the whole digitalization shift, but also your reflections on what to do now when things are opening up again, what of the new behaviors will be kept. Josef, if we then look at Getinge, and maybe if we go beyond that, everyone is now communicating and having digital business meetings instead of traveling and meeting in person. What other things did you see happening in the Getinge group in terms of digitalization, and what do you think will be what of all this will we take on further?
I mean, in general, Getinge was already well prepared for digital. This is to echo Marie-Sophie. Swedish companies have this tendency to be more digital, and you have seen this also, I think, in your report. What will stay is, and this is a big learning for us, is it's more a paradigm shift in leadership in industry, in our industry, because leadership dogma was to be present at all continents as a manager. In the past, we were traveling a lot, every 6 weeks on another continent for a couple of weeks to see factory managers and other things. And we thought this is needed. What we learned is we can collaborate through digital tools, through more efficient ways and not traveling that much, has both positive impacts on our CO2 footprint, the sustainability effects, but makes collaboration as well easier. I mean, of course, we need to respect, and this is really in our culture, do we respect human aspects of collaboration, and not everything can be done virtually. If you have a difficult conflict to manage, you need to see each other. And but this is a very big learning, and we have seen this also, and this is very interesting to us. German hospital or healthcare managers are extremely conservative people. It's nearly like they don't want to have a smartphone. But nowadays they are asking us, hey, we have seen this is really a great tool to stay in touch. So they are asking for video conferencing, they are asking for virtual tools. So I think this was, as Marie-Sophie said, it was bad circumstances, but it was a needed push towards something good, because otherwise I would have seen for Germany difficulties to catch up with the rest, where other countries are far more developed. So in general, it's an internal effect and an external effect. The outcome is for both the same. It's positive impacts, with the but not to forget about the human effects of collaboration. And I'm happy to work here for a Swedish company because they look very much on the human side as well. Whereas I see in colleagues from US companies, they are looking very much on the quarterly numbers. This is then the cultural aspect. And yeah, this is to your question.
Interesting also, as you're coming from kind of the large healthcare sector, and we heard earlier from Erika that one of the main hindrance in digitalization is data protection in Germany. So that also in your sector, Josef, that also medical doctors now want to communicate and work in a new way.
Yeah, probably this was a learning for the German authorities as well, that we need to open up a bit the data protection, and that data can help to solve big issues. And I mean, there is a hell of a discussion ongoing still about what the government is doing with all the informations that are gathered today with the testing and other stuff. But there is a greater, or the openness to discuss digital solutions is increasing, and we have strong collaborations. Our think tank in Solna for digital solutions is in collaboration with Charité, for example, very famous university clinic, to find ways of digital collaborations between hospitals, patients, and the clinicians as such. So we are here at the forefront, and it's good that the openness is now increasing. And I probably heard that the German government last year was putting the so-called Hospital Future Act in place. It's a 3 billion euro investment of the government in digitalization of the healthcare sector, including the big question around how we deal with data protection. So I think it's interesting how one event, a big, needless to say, but how one event can really bring big changes and needed changes forward.
Very good. So I think we are almost ready to move over to questions from the audience, which we have gotten a few, but we also welcome to get a few more. But before that, let's turn a bit over to sustainability. And I know that this is an area which is very close to your heart, Thomas, as well as to the member countries in Germany. The Chamber of Commerce had actually sustainability as the thematics for 2 years in a row. So how do you view, Thomas, that Swedish companies are fairly ahead in sustainability and energy efficiency, etc.? What is the impact of that for the business in Germany?
I think they are actually ahead, and it's not. There are a lot of big Swedish companies actually, not just they are working, but also thinking a little bit in another way, because I say before we got new regulation, we want to be there. So actually they are ahead a few years maybe. And sustainability, it's not just, oh, we have to do that because of the regulation. I think by most of the Swedes, it's actually in the heart, but not as a fighting against the industry, because most of the new solutions is coming actually from the industry. And I think it's a big difference, I think German companies also have a lot to learn from Swedish companies. Maybe not from the technical way to make this sustainable change, but the way how to do it, the way how to connect the co-workers, the society around, and doing things together, and stop with this against each other, if you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Good, interesting. So let's pick up a question from the audience, or let's combine two questions. What is the best about working at a Swedish company, but also how is having a Swedish brand, how is that supporting the business? Marie-Sophie, how are you thinking on these two aspects, working for a Swedish company and being part of a Swedish brand?
I think working for a Swedish company, I had to, when Thomas just said it, and actually all of us in this group said it, I think for me, if I have to summarize it, it's kind of an uncompromising naturalness about how to do business. And I think that's something that I learned in the 5 years that I've now been at Readly, which is the fact that every problem can be discussed, every matter can be brought to the table, whether it's work-life balance, family life, business development, solutions, problems. And there's always a way how you feel like there is a solution that can be found and that can be worked out together. So that kind of naturalness is something that especially stands in contrast to some of the German ways of doing it sometimes, as we said. And I think it helps to have that mentality. So I've really tried to internalize that, and I want to bring that, and I can combine it with some of my more German traits. But that to me is something that I'm really proud of when I come here and I can embody that. And when in regards to a Swedish brand, I think it's fun to see how it stands for progress. As Thomas said, it stands for progress, it stands for openness, it's recognized in the world and in Germany for what it has already achieved and the kind of mentality that stands behind it. So we, for example, don't necessarily market with it as our main USP, but we see that people know about the story, and then that gives us credibility in the market, which is a fantastic asset. So I think, for example, in our case, the challenge and question is more, how actively do we want to use it, and what does the future then look like? So both very positive.
That's a boost to hear. Yeah. Another one for you, Josef, and I think we have one more minute for last question. How do you see that your customers do take sustainability into account in their purchase decisions?
And it's, I mean, lots of our customers are governmental, at least guided, so to say. So this will have a big impact. And but also the healthcare providers as such, and our industry customers from the pharmaceutical industry, they are looking for sustainable partners as well. And I think what Thomas said is true. We are ahead in that at least what I can see in our industry, Jaeckel is ahead, and the culture of our companies here, it's not sustainable or economically successful, it's sustainable and economically successful. This is the way forward. And in the German culture, it's more the or question. Do you want us to be sustainable or successful? And this is what I think a very big advantage for us. Also, if we talk to hospital customers, I mean, healthcare is creating a lot of waste every day by the consumables they're using in the hospitals. And we are providing here also solutions to help our healthcare customers, the hospital, to consume less energy, less chemicals, and less other stuff. So, and this is in the DNA of the company. It's not that you need to ask the engineers, hey, you need to develop a more sustainable solution. They do it. So
in the DNA.
It's
excellent,
in the DNA.
Excellent to summarize it. That I think by that we have kind of come to the end of our hour today. We hope that all that has been tuning in has gotten some inspiration for how to move forward in the Swedish-German business relationship. I very much like to thank everyone involved, our State Secretary, Per, our ambassador, you panelists, my colleague Erika and the Business Sweden team and Team Sweden, Embassy and Chamber of Commerce that has been behind the event today. The survey will be available soon, and we look forward to share that with all of you. And I just like to highlight that there is a chance to 16th of June in 1 week, tune in again on a German-Swedish webinar, then with the focus of mobility. Thank you very much, everyone, for today.